Hello everyone, today we are going to watch the recap of the movie titled, Virgin's Territory. A youngster seeks safety in a chapel, where the nuns use him as a sex toy. Despite his feelings for her, he falls in love with a princess who comes to church to avoid a tug. The film begins with a man painting in a church. He had been working in this church for several days, but had not been paid for this effort. Then he goes to church father and asks for money. But then he hears that the church father perished as a result of the plague. It's heartbreaking to witness all of this, since he'll never get his money back. When he sees the father's robe stretched out, he decides to become a pastor. Next, we see a boy named Lorenzo escaping from a man named Gerbino. He manages to escape while leaving the court, but Gerbino orders his men to capture Lorenzo. After this, Lorenzo consults with his friends, who advise him to leave town so that Gerbino cannot find him. Lorenzo accepts and embraces his companions before riding away. We then meet a princess named Pampinia. Her parents perished during the plague and she was heartbroken as a result. Then there comes Gerbino. Gerbino seeks to take advantage of the fact that Pampinia has no one remaining in this world. He inquires what she is going to do now. According to Pampinia, she had agreed to marry Prince Gino, so Gerbino told her that your father had borrowed plenty of money from me, and that after his demise, he is entitled to all of his wealth. He says you just have this house, and if you would like to keep it, then you must marry me. Then we see Lorenzo being followed by the Gerbino men. Lorenzo comes across a man carrying a corpse. He questions the man about the corpse, and the man tells him that the deceased was a mute and deaf man, who worked as a gardener in a nearby church, but he is now dead. Hearing this, Lorenzo concludes that since this guy is no longer, there is certainly a need for another man, and he might remain deaf and dumb in the church. Lorenzo then climbs a tree to avoid Gerbino's men. As Gerbino men departs, he starts to descend from the tree, but the trunk breaks and Lorenzo falls to the ground. That's how he ends up unconscious. Meanwhile, we see some nuns arrive. They picks up Lorenzo and drives him to church. The nun was so lustful that she couldn't stop looking at Lorenzo, and began stroking him in a sensual manner. Lorenzo seemed conscious but pretended to be unconscious, since he enjoyed it as well. Then a nun arrives, and they inform her that this man is dumb and deaf. The elderly nun is overjoyed, since she only wanted a deaf-dumb man to assist in church work, and she hires Lorenzo. Lorenzo pretends to be deaf and dumb. Once, when Lorenzo was bathing, two nuns arrived and get undressed, and joined him in the tub. Lorenzo enjoyed himself well with both of them. Actually, the nuns used to employ deaf mutes, so they could intimidate with them without anyone figuring out. Meanwhile, we witness Pampinia moving into a church to reside, in order to get away from Gerbino. This is the same church where Lorenzo is employed. Pampinia notices Lorenzo as two nuns clothe her. She asks a nun who this young man is, and the nun replies his name is Lorenzo. He is the gardener and looks after the church. Sadly, he is deaf and mute. While Lorenzo was performing his duties, a nun arrives. They both went to the bushes to engage in intimate actions, but Pampinia saw them, and upon seeing them, she became quite envious, since she had begun to adore Lorenzo. Following that, we witness King of Perugia, Gino, visiting the palace of Pampinia, but Gerbino informs him that Pampinia will be marrying him and orders them to depart. However, Gino was informed by a man outside that Pampinia was waiting for him in another city for a quite couple of days. After hearing this, he decides to travel to that city. Then we come across Lorenzo, who is met by two nuns. They actually knew what the other nuns had done to him, and was hoping to do the same to them. Lorenzo agrees, and the two begin an intimate relationship. Over time, Pampinia grew to like and be attracted to Lorenzo. One day, while working, Lorenzo began to sing, and Pampinia noticed him and discovered that he was not mute and deaf. One day, Pampinia goes to Lorenzo, blindfolds him, then she removes her disguise and declares her love for him, and her readiness about marrying him. She gives Lorenzo a gentle touch and a kiss before walking away. He couldn't see her since the blindfold is covering his eyes. After a few days, Pampinia has to depart, but not before telling the nuns the fact that Lorenzo was never deaf and dumb. He is in fact completely healthy and is only acting this way. Pampinia in fact disliked to seeing Lorenzo with anybody else. After learning this, the elderly nun became quite enraged and expelled Lorenzo from the church. When Pampinia returned home, she discovered Lorenzo waiting outside. He begs Pampinia to take him with her, and Pampinia accepts because she already loves him. Afterwards, we see the prince, who was searching for Pampinia, approaches a girl in a lake and asking her if she knows Pampinia, because he is the Prince of Perugia and wants to wed Pampinia. The girl responds that she is Pampinia. After hearing this, he likewise assumes that this is real, as he had never seen Pampinia before. While walking home with Pampinia, Lorenzo tells him that, while he was working in the church, he fell in love with a girl, who then kissed him while wearing a blindfold. Upon hearing this, Pampinia realizes that Lorenzo feels the same way towards her. Despite Pampinia's question about how he will identify the girl, Lorenzo asserts he will find somehow. When Pampinia was about to reveal to him that she was that girl, Gerbino appeared out of nowhere. Seeing Lorenzo, he was furious and challenged him to a battle. However, Lorenzo didn't have the strength to stand in front of him. Pampinia stops Gerbino from killing and warns him that, if something happens to him, she would never marry him. After learning this, Gerbino decides to imprison Lorenzo rather than executing him. The following day, Pampinia informs Gerbino that she will wed him the following day, but that he must first free Lorenzo. The father, who approves the marriage, recognizes Lorenzo and claims that he is the same person who painted the chapel. Following that, two Gerbino's men enter the forest with Lorenzo in an effort to free him, but their true goal was to assassinate him, before they could take any action. Lorenzo attacks them. He then discovers that the prince is going to rescue Pampinia, so he decides to follow the suit. He then observes Gerbino's efforts to compel Pampinia to marriage. The prince suddenly appears carrying a rifle. Gerbino, who is aware of his fear of firearms, flees, but the prince eventually captures him and also murders his soldiers. Pampinia ultimately informs the prince that she cannot wed him, because she loves Lorenzo. When the prince recognizes Pampinia after she removes her mask, he declares that she is not the Pampinia. Therefore, he heads to Philomena, the girl he met on the lake. He marries her, claiming that she is his Pampinia. At the end of the film, Pampinia approaches Lorenzo and proposes her love towards him. However, Lorenzo declines, saying that he has fallen in love with someone else and wants to wed her. When Pampinia hears this, she asks him for a kiss. Lorenzo responds by kissing her, and realizing that Pampinia is the woman who kissed him in the church. And the movie ends. Thanks for watching the video.